For tonight's opening remarks, we're going to have a slideshow, and the slideshow is going to be, here it is. It's called "What is Marcyism and Why is it Degenerating into Liberalism? The Origins of PSL, Workers' World Party, People's Forum, etc." Now, why is it important to do this kind of thing, right? Last night I did a stream about why we're no longer calling ourselves communists, but we're calling ourselves innovationists, and why we have largely broken and we have nothing to do with the woke left, and that, what communism has come to mean in American politics is pretty much something we're opposed to. And so on that basis, we want to continue having streams explaining the roots of the anti-imperialist movement and the worldview and what we're trying to do with the Center for Political Innovation. And the reason it's important to do this is not because we're just angry and we want to sow discord and we want to tear other groups down. It's not that at all. It's because CPI, we are a small organization. There's not very many of us. That's okay. We're getting a lot done, and we have really done a lot to change the conversation already. But people wonder, why do we exist? We're a small group, so why do we exist? Why don't we just join, the Communist Party? Why don't we just join, PSL or one of these other groups? Well, there's a reason. And that's because none of these groups are doing what we do. They're doing the opposite. And if we were to join one of those groups, we'd be on the opposite side. And that in order to do the right thing, to oppose the danger of a new world war, and to stand against the emerging low-wage police state, and to build the anti-imperialist movement among the masses of the American people that is urgently needed in our time, we have to have our own organization, and we have to organize in our own way. And so if you're wondering why we don't all just join the Party of Socialism and Liberation, if you're wondering why we are very opposed to Brian Becker and the Answer Coalition and the People's Forum and these kinds of organizations, and why we are in opposition to them, why they've expressed so much hostility towards us, why we view them in such a negative light, and where all of this came from, that's what tonight's PowerPoint will talk about. And I'm actually going to talk a lot about the history of anti-imperialist organizing in America. I mean, this live stream basically goes over the course of 3 generations. I mean, I'm starting with the Communist Party and events that took place before the Russian Revolution, and I'm ending with the debate surrounding Rage Against the War Machine and the COVID lockdowns and Jimmy Dore and all kinds of stuff like that. So it's actually quite an all-inclusive conversation, and it's going to be quite an interesting stream. So buckle up, keep the super chats rolling in for anything that you would like me to answer in the second half of the show. And we're just going to jump right into it. The title is, "What is Marcyism and Why is it Degenerating into Liberalism? The Origins of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the Workers' World Party, the People's Forum, etc." Sam Marcy, his actual name was Sam Balan, but he went by the name Sam Marcy, was born in 1911. And he was born in the Russian Empire, in the region of the Russian Empire that is now called Ukraine. And in the Russian Empire, Jews were segregated. They were forced to live in separate villages. In cities, they had the Jewish area, it was called the ghetto. But in rural areas, they had villages that were all Jewish villages, and then they had other villages. So his family lived in a Jewish village in Ukraine. And during the Russian Civil War, which was the civil war that happened after the Bolshevik Revolution, there were 2 armies that were fighting for control of Russia. The Red Army, that was led by the Bolsheviks, and the White Army that was led by people that wanted to restore the Tsar, anti-communists, etc. And the White Army was notoriously anti-Semitic, and when they would reach Jewish villages, they would often kill everyone or raid and murder and people. They would do pogroms. And so Sam Marcy, one of his earliest memories of childhood is when the Red Army protected his village shortly after the Russian Revolution. He remembers the Red Army soldiers protecting his village, and how they gave cigarettes to the to the people there, which back then, I guess smoking was not frowned upon. So that was seen as a very kind and generous thing to do. I mean, this is a very impoverished area, right? Rural Ukraine was it was in the dark ages back then. They didn't have running water. They didn't have electricity. It was a pretty poor place to be in, rural Ukraine in, 1918, 1920. But the Red Army, not only did they protect his village, but they gave people cigarettes. They were very nice. And he had this early childhood memory of his family being protected by the communist Red Army. Now, he eventually moved to Brooklyn, New York as a small child. His father and then his mother and his brothers, they moved to Brooklyn, New York. And as a teenager, growing up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1930s, he joined the Communist Party USA, and he actually became the leader of the Brooklyn Young Communist League, which was a massive organization. Nowadays, the Young Communist League, you think, okay, that's like 12 people or whatever, but back then it was thousands of people. And in Brooklyn, New York in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, it was thousands of people were in the Young Communist League. And that's actually a picture there of the Young Communist League marching in a parade. And they had hats and uniforms, and they carried sticks, and it was a big group. And the Communist Party and the Young Communist League were massive organizations. And their focus was on building labor unions and protesting for the rights of the unemployed workers. At the same time, they defended the Soviet Union as the homeland of the workers' revolution. They had huge hunger marches of unemployed people where they would break into City Hall demanding that the government take action to provide food for hungry families. People were literally starving to death across the United States and across New York City at this time. And there were massive unemployed protests where thousands and thousands of unemployed people would demand that they be provided with food, demand that they be provided with relief, because back in this time, there were no food stamps and there was no unemployment insurance, and unemployed people were desperate. And so because of that, they had to form a mass movement of the unemployed, and the Communist Party was the main organizer of this mass movement of the unemployed. And Sam Marcy was part of it as a young immigrant from Brooklyn, grew up speaking Russian in his household, born in Russian Ukraine, and he was involved in this mass protest movement for the rights of the unemployed. And it was quite militant, and the Communist Party had a lot of people back in these years. So in 1928, Stalin ordered the Communist Party to move its headquarters from New York City to Chicago and to appear more American, because the majority of members of the Communist Party were like Sam Marcy. They were immigrants. They were people from Eastern Europe. They were people from Ireland, people from Italy, people from Russia. And, the Communist Party were always accused of being agents of the Soviet Union. They were foreign agents, etc. So Stalin wanted them to move their headquarters to Chicago, which was a city that was in the American heartland. It was an industrial city. Whereas New York City is more cosmopolitan, associated with Wall Street. And Stalin also wanted them to pick leaders who were more American, i.e., not foreigners. And the leader of the Communist Party during this time was William Z. Foster, who was an Irish Catholic from Philadelphia. And the other leader was a guy named Earl Browder. And Earl Browder was a farmer from Kansas, and he had an Anglo name, Browder. His family was English heritage, and his name was Earl Browder, and he was from Kansas. And during his presidential campaigns, he even used the nickname, the Man from Kansas. And then later, the leader of the Communist Party was a guy named Gus Hall, who was a guy of Finnish heritage from Minnesota, was a steel worker, worked on the iron ranges in Minnesota. So the Communist Party very much didn't want to be perceived as a foreign organization. And that was really a lot of Stalin's orientation, was that Stalin understood that if they wanted to have a revolution in the United States, they needed to really capture the soul of the American people. They couldn't just be a foreign group of radicals. Sam Marcy didn't agree with this. He considered moving the headquarters to Chicago to be pandering to reaction. And honestly, Sam Marcy felt that this was unfair to him, right? He was born in Ukraine. He had a thick Brooklyn Russian accent, and he was Jewish. And he felt like they were pushing guys like him into the background, and that was unfair. And that he felt this was, quote, pandering to reaction. He didn't like the idea of the Communist Party moving its headquarters to Chicago and becoming more based among the U.S. population, etc. He didn't appreciate that. Sam Marcy resigned from the Communist Party in 1934. That's the year after Hitler took power in Germany. Hitler took power in Germany in 1933. And Sam Marcy, he left the Communist Party. And the reason that he left the Communist Party was he felt there should have been an armed uprising when Hitler took power in Germany. Now, this is not correct, but this was how a lot of trotskyists and a lot of Jewish Americans felt. They felt Hitler was so bad, and there was such a large Communist Party in Germany that as soon as Hitler took power, they should have immediately just took up arms and violently revolted. Now, if that had happened, the German government would have known where all the communists were and put them in concentration camps, and there wouldn't have been any underground resistance movement. And actually, throughout the 1930s and up into World War II, there was a very effective network of spies and underground resistance forces that, blew up the train tracks to prevent Jews from being, sent to the gas chambers, that infiltrated and maneuvered and sent intelligence and all of that. And the communists of Germany, they chose to go underground rather than take up arms against Hitler coming to power. And that was the right thing to do. On top of that, Sam Marcy and others felt that the German communists should have aligned with the Social Democrats against Hitler. Well, they tried, and the Social Democrats didn't want to. And the Social Democrats were in an anti-communist frenzy. There were many examples of Social Democrats, had police among their ranks who gunned down communists, and that the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, if they had aligned, they could have stopped Hitler, but they weren't going to align. They were two different parties. They had killed each other. It was not going to happen. And the Communist Party of Germany was a party of the desperately unemployed, which is what the Communist Party USA was. And the Social Democratic Party of Germany was the party of the labor unions, of the industrial workers who still had jobs during the Great Depression. And they just didn't see eye to eye. So the German communists and Social Democrats were not going to team up to fight Hitler. And the German communists, if they had taken up arms immediately after Hitler came to power and just launched an uprising, it would have resulted in everything they had being smashed, and they wouldn't have had the effective underground network that they had during the Second World War. But Sam Marcy, being a Jewish American, was very, very upset that Hitler came to power. And so he was very upset that the Communist Party didn't take up arms. And he also didn't appreciate that they discriminated against him for being foreign born. And they were trying to appear more American. So he quit the Communist Party in 1934. Now, he joined the Trotskyists. Now, who was Trotsky? Trotsky was a follower. It was a leader of the Russian Revolution. He was a Russian radical figure who'd been kind of a rival and a critic of Lenin, but he had joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917. He'd been a leader of the Red Army. He'd been an important political figure in Russia, and he had a falling out with Stalin, and he was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1927. And outside of the Soviet Union, Trotsky ran around the world building a new communist organization called the Fourth International, that was against Stalin. Trotsky said he was the true communist, that Stalin was selling out the revolution. And Trotsky had his theory of permanent revolution, which said that the Soviet Union was doomed because the only place that you could, that it really counted to have a socialist revolution was the Western imperialist countries. You had to have a revolution in America and in Britain and in France and in Germany, and that the Soviet Union was kind of doomed unless they had a revolution in the West. Trotsky called New York City the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. Trotsky believed the West was the best. And unless you had a communist revolution in the West, the Soviet Union was doomed. And so he pushed for permanent revolution. And he wanted the Soviet Union to militarize its economy and just function as kind of a military holdout that would strengthen, armed revolts all across the capitalist world. Whereas Stalin believed in socialism in one country. And he believed that with a planned economy, they could industrialize, they could raise their people out of poverty, and they could have a socialist society. So Trotsky and Stalin disagreed. Trotsky was exiled from the USSR, and he was building the Fourth International. And Sam Marcy joined the Fourth International because that was the alternative to the Communist Party. And there were many intellectuals and smart people, writers, who did join the Fourth International because it was a way that one could be radical and associated with communism, but not be associated with the Soviet Union. Now, Trotsky felt that the Soviet Union was what he called a degenerated workers' state or a deformed workers' state, meaning that it was socialist and a workers' state in its foundations, but it was led by what he called a parasitical bureaucracy or a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, that Stalin and the leaders of the Soviet Communist Party were no good, but the economic foundations were socialist. That was what the Fourth International and Trotsky preached. Now, what's interesting is that Trotskyism as a movement, it was much smaller than the Communist Party, but it recruited a lot of intellectuals, a lot of writers, a lot of Marxist academics and others. And why was that? Well, it was because the Communist Party was very action-oriented, and they did amazing things. This is a picture of one of their unemployment demonstrations, where look at all these whole families of unemployed people gathering, free milk for children of the workers, they organized these huge demonstrations where people would go out and fight the police and smash store windows and take the food out and redistribute the food to the hungry people. And, the Communist Party was very go, and action oriented. They organized the bonus army, where thousands of veterans, thousands of veterans occupied the National Mall and set up a tent encampment demanding that they be paid veterans benefits, and that the Communist Party very much had a very kind of military top-down atmosphere, and there wasn't much room for debate. And if you showed up and you asked too many questions, you were seen as kind of getting in the way, and you were gotten rid of. Nelson Peary, who's a writer I really admire, he was in the Communist Party, and he told the story of how they had a state convention, and at the state convention of the Communist Party, they were having a resolution to honor Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, and and he disagreed with some of what Tito said, so he got up and he said, "Well, I'd like to speak against Tito," and the room went silent. And there was like dead silence. And then afterwards, they took him aside and they were saying, we don't really think that the party is right for you. And they were almost going to expel him. But then the next day, the headline on the Daily Worker was "Stalin denounces Tito." And so then they thought, wow, he must be a genius. And they welcomed him back in. And that's kind of how the Communist Party was. You weren't really allowed to disagree. It was, we're here to organize big demonstrations and big mass movements of the unemployed. And if you ask too many questions or you're, debating stuff, we're going to view you with suspicion. And that atmosphere that the Communist Party had, where you weren't really allowed to ask questions, where the focus was just on building these mass demonstrations and defending the Soviet Union, that is why many intellectuals joined the Trotskyites, because the Trotskyites were very intellectual, and there was a lot of debate and a lot of, arguing back and forth, etc. So Sam Marcy joined the Trotskyites, which at the time were dominated by intellectuals. Now, in New York City in particular, Trotskyism was dominated by a clique of people called the New York Intellectuals. And the leaders of the New York Intellectuals were Max Shachtman, Martin Aburn, and James Burnham. And all of them became, most of the New York intellectuals, these leaders of Trotskyism in New York City during the 1930s, most of them became neoconservatives after World War II. They became full-on anti-communist Republican neocons after World War II. And they hated the Soviet Union, and they were very academic in their focus. And they ran New York City Trotskyism. And Sam Marcy didn't get along with them very well. They didn't like him. He was working class. He was from a poor family. And, he liked the Soviet Union. Sam Marcy, had a very strong loyalty to the Soviet Union. They had rescued his family, etc. Maybe he didn't agree with Stalin. Maybe he had a falling out with the Communist Party, but he still very much felt that you must defend the Soviet Union. Now, in 1939, the New York intellectuals had a falling out with Trotsky. And that was because in 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact. And they did that because the Soviet Union wanted to have an alliance against the Nazis with a number of different countries. But all the Western capitalist countries turned them down. France temporarily had an alliance with the Soviet Union and then broke it. And because of that, the Soviet Union, to buy time, because they knew the Nazis were planning to invade them, they signed a temporary non-aggression pact with the Nazis in 1939. And the New York intellectuals, the big leaders of New York City Trotskyism, Max Shachtman, Martin Aburn, and James Burnham, they were disgusted by that. And they said the Soviet Union must not be a socialist country. It must not be a workers' state at all. It must be, it must just be state capitalism, or some of them said it was a new economic system called bureaucrat collectivism that was neither capitalist or socialist. But the New York intellectuals, they wanted nothing to do with the Soviet Union after they signed the non-aggression pact with the Nazis. It's funny, there's even a song that the Trotskyists published to make fun of the Soviet Union for signing the non-aggression pact. Let me see if I can put it on. It's the stupidest song you've ever heard, but they wrote this, this song to make fun of the Soviet Union. Maybe I'll just sing it for you. It's to the tune of My Darling Clementine. In old Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian writing out the party line. It was very stupid. They just hated the Soviet Union. So Sam Marcy, he didn't get along with the New York intellectuals, and they kind of marginalized him inside of New York City Trotskyism because he was too pro-Soviet. So he ended up just going to law school, and he got a law degree, and he became a lawyer for the Paper Box Workers Union in New York City. And that was his job. He was a union lawyer. He was a Trotskyite, but he didn't really fit in with the New York City intellectuals. So he made friends with a Broadway Shakespearean actor, this guy, Vince Copeland. And Vince Copeland had been in the Communist Party, but in the late 1930s, the Communist Party just focused on campaigning for Roosevelt and supporting the Democrats. And Vince Copeland, he was disappointed with how much the Communist Party was kind of watering down their message, not really preaching socialism, but just kind of supporting the Democrats in a popular front against fascism. And he made friends with Sam Marcy, and he became a Trotskyist as well. Sam Marcy also married Dorothy Ballin. And Dorothy Ballin, Sam Marcy's name was Ballin. Dorothy Ballin was a woman he met and married and she was a union activist in the Paper Box Workers Union, which was the union that hired Sam Marcy to be their lawyer. Sam Marcy, the three of them were kind of a trio. Dorothy Ballin, Vince Copeland, and Sam Marcy. And they were just this group of Trotskyites in New York City, these three New York City Trotskyists who were way more pro-Soviet than everybody else. They liked the Soviet Union, they defended the Soviet Union, and they didn't really fit in with the New York intellectuals who ran Trotskyism in New York City. So in 1940, right before the USA entered World War II, they had the idea to move to Buffalo, New York, where there was a big steel mill, right? Bethlehem Steel Corporation has been set up in Buffalo. There was a big steel factory there. And there was the Communist Party. They had a lot of steel workers that were members of the Communist Party there, but they didn't have anybody from the Trotskyites. And so their idea was to move to Buffalo and start their own Trotskyite organization in Buffalo, New York. So they moved to upstate New York to Buffalo, all three of them. Now, what the story that I always heard was that I guess Sam Marcy was a lawyer, but he wanted to work in the steel mill because that was very working class, but he was very spacey and his head was always caught in politics, and he got injured because a steel mill is a very dangerous place, and he got injured. And so after that, the comrades insisted that he just practice law and be a lawyer and not work in the steel mill. Vince Copeland worked in the steel mill, and they set up a storefront in Buffalo, New York, and they were part of the Trotskyite Socialist Workers Party in Buffalo, New York. And they had a storefront, and they put a pool table in the front of the storefront because they wanted steel workers to come and hang out at this communist office. The idea was that this would be like a working class hangout. Well, it didn't really end up being that. And in fact, it actually became kind of a place that college kids could go and get communist books because communist books were banned from the libraries. And after World War II, McCarthyism set in. And McCarthyism was a very, very awful period. If you were a communist, you went to jail, you couldn't get a job, the FBI would follow you around, etc. And in Buffalo, New York, it was very bad. I mean, I went to Buffalo, New York. I was in the Workers' World Party, which is the party Sam Marcy started. And I met a woman who had been recruited to the Workers' World Party, or the Socialist Workers Party, who'd worked in the bookstore and lived in Buffalo at the time. And she talked about how when they fired every steel worker who was a member of the Communist Party from the steel plant, Sam Marcy and his friends, they went out and had a protest in front of the plant saying that workers in the steel mill had the right to be a member of any political party that they wanted. And she was a teacher. And then the next day when she went to school, the FBI showed up at her job, and she was called to the principal's office, and they had photos of her at the protest. And the principal saw that and they said, "Is that you in this communist protest in front of the steel mill?" She said, "Yes." And he said, "You're fired." So she got fired from her job for going to a protest to support steel workers. Communist steel workers were fired in Buffalo, New York. Couple years later, she got another job as a teacher, and the FBI showed up at her job again and got her fired. And she ended up having to be a telephone switchboard operator. And the FBI came to that job with photos of her at communist events. But the switchboard company said, "Well, we don't care if you're a communist as long as you leave it at home, don't bring it to work." And so she was able to work as a switchboard operator. And that's how bad it was for communists during these years. And their bookstore was a place you could get communist books. Back then, if you went to the public library and you got a communist book, they would keep it behind the counter, and you had to show ID to get the communist book from the public library, and they would write your name down, and the FBI might come visit you and ask why you were looking at those books. I mean, it was a really harsh time. The lack of freedom of speech, etc. Being a communist in America was a very, very difficult thing in the late 40s and early 1950s. The Communist Party's national leadership were all thrown in federal prison. It was a pretty hard time. They actually passed a law in 1951 called the McCarran Internal Security Act that commissioned the Department of Justice to make a list of 2 million people who would be put into concentration camps if there was a national emergency declared. Now, that law was struck down eventually by the Supreme Court, but that shows you how intense it was. They were actually they were prepared to put communists in concentration camps. And so it was a very, very hard time to be a communist. But Sam Marcy and his group of followers in Buffalo, New York, they kept organizing, and they had their bookstore. They were in the Socialist Workers Party, but they were very different than the rest of the Socialist Workers Party because they aligned with the Communist Party, right? The Socialist Workers Party, they were trotskyists, and their approach was to denounce the Communist Party. They felt the Communist Party were Stalinists, they had abandoned the revolution or whatever, and so they would go around opposing the Communist Party. If the Communist Party had an event, they would protest outside. This is a Stalinist event. This is for evil Stalin, the mass murderer. Well, the approach of Sam Marcy was that if the Communist Party was having an event, they would participate in it. and they would support it. At the time, the Communist Party organized the Civil Rights Congress. That was one of the main activities that the Communist Party did, was to support the Black Freedom Movement. And they formed the Civil Rights Congress. Well, Sam Marcy and his followers, they supported the Civil Rights Congress. And even though they weren't allowed to join, they made a point of, passing out leaflets to promote and support what the Civil Rights Congress did, etc. They formed a group called the Mothers Alliance Against Racism. And they organized black and white mothers to organize to demand free milk and school lunches for kids, and to have marches to support the civil rights movement in Buffalo, New York. And that was their approach. And when the Communist Party's national leadership was thrown in federal prison, they drove down from Buffalo and they protested outside the trial in support of the Communist Party. And that was their feeling, was that the way to oppose the Stalinists, which is what they called the Communist Party, was to do whatever they did, but do it better and do it in a more radical way, and show that you were a more effective organizer than the Stalinists, not to denounce them, not to side with the bourgeoisie against them. And one thing that they were famous for is that, they would run for office as third-party candidates, right? They ran for governor, they ran for mayor of Buffalo, New York, and all of that. And they would not denounce Stalin during their campaigns, even though they were Trotskyists. If they were asked, do you support Stalin? They would say, yes, Stalin's part of our class camp. He's a leader of the Soviet Union, which is a country that was born in workers' revolution. While we might not agree with Stalin, he's part of our class camp, and they wouldn't denounce Stalin. And that made the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party very angry, because as far as they were concerned, the first thing you do is denounce Stalin, because you want everyone to know you're not like the evil Soviet Union. They just had a very, very different approach to their Trotskyism than the rest of the Socialist Workers' Party. And in 1948, Henry Wallace ran for president of the United States. And Sam Marcy wanted the Socialist Workers' Party to endorse Henry Wallace. And his followers in the Socialist Workers' Party, they called themselves the Global Class War Tendency. That's what they were known for, because they argued that there was a global class war, and that the Soviet Union was on one side and U.S. imperialism was on the other. And so they were the Global Class War Tendency. That's what they were known as. And they organized the Mothers Alliance Against Racism, and they had a storefront in Buffalo, New York, with a pool table where they gave out Marxist books. And they were just this little group in Buffalo, New York. It was a handful of people, and they did a lot of work to support the Steelworkers Union, etc. It was just a handful of people, maybe 10 or 12 people. It was not a very big group at this time, and they were the Buffalo wing of the Socialist Workers' Party. And then in 1956, Stalin had died, and Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev gave his secret speech denouncing Stalin. And that speech was praised by Trotskyists. They all thought it was very good. It showed that they had been right about Stalin all along. It was a very revolutionary speech, and that it exposed all of Stalin's crimes. Sam Marcy didn't see it that way at all. Sam Marcy felt that the secret speech was full of lies. The idea that Stalin was so afraid when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he hid under his desk and started crying. That was bullshit. That didn't happen. Stalin was a bank robber. Stalin was someone who could look danger right in the face. The idea that Stalin, was just so weak in the face of the Soviet Union, or the Nazis invading, that just didn't happen, right? And that they saw the secret speech, even though they didn't like Stalin, they saw the secret speech as pandering to U.S. imperialism. The secret speech was bullshit, and they didn't endorse it, whereas the Trotskyites loved the secret speech. The same year, there was an uprising in Hungary against the Soviet-aligned government, and the Soviet Union sent the military to crush it. They sent the Soviet army to Hungary to crush it. Now, the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party supported the uprising in Hungary. They saw it as a working-class uprising against Stalinism. However, Sam Marcy and his followers, they saw the Hungarian uprising as a fascist revolt, because people like Cardinal Mindszenty and others were associated with it. And they saw it as being organized by the CIA, and they supported the Soviet Union in crushing it. And so that was their feeling, was that they supported the Soviet Union crushing the Hungarian uprising. And around the same time, the Socialist Workers' Party had a petition campaign going around and trying to get people to sign a petition calling for the U.S. Army to be sent to the South to protect Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And that was a big campaign, troops to the South. And Sam Marcy didn't agree with that. He said that the U.S. military was U.S. imperialism, and instead he wanted to support Black people who took up arms to engage in self-defense. He said you shouldn't support the U.S. government in sending troops. You should be encouraging Black people to learn to defend themselves and have armed self-defense. And so these were pretty big differences. They were on the opposite sides in the Hungarian revolt. They had an opposite analysis of Khrushchev's secret speech. They didn't agree that, they had a very different approach to the civil rights movement and how it should be defended from the violence of racists, etc. And so they were a faction of the Socialist Workers' Party called the Global Class War Tendency. People called them the Marcyites, and they had a disagreement with the Socialist Workers' Party. And Sam Marcy told his followers that the best way to argue for their position was to be the most loyal and dedicated members of the party, to work really, really hard, because that was an argument in favor of their position. And so they had some of the highest numbers in selling the SWP's newspaper. They got some of the most petitions to get SWP candidates on the ballot. And the idea was that if they worked really, really hard, that would be a way to convince the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party to adopt positions closer to their positions. And it didn't work. And in 1959, the global class war tendency of the Socialist Workers' Party resigned. And they started their own newspaper called Workers' World. And a year later, they just started calling themselves the Workers' World Party. They couldn't quite agree on a name, but they had the newspaper Workers' World, and everyone knew them by their newspapers. They figured everyone knows our newspaper will just be Workers' World Party. And in 1959, the party was started. It started going by Workers' World Party in 1960. And that's the first, the early issues of the paper. Every issue had a picture of Lenin and Trotsky in every issue. And people called them the Maoist Trotskyites because they embraced China. So right before he died, Trotsky was assassinated. Right before he was assassinated, World War II had already started. And Trotsky said that World War II could only end with a working class revolution, that the war would become permanent and it would only end with the working class of Europe rising up and overthrowing capitalism. That's what Trotsky said. And so that's why, some Trotskyists will say that World War II is still going on, which I think is hilarious. But Trotsky said it could only end with the Workers' Revolution, right? So the Spartacist League, if you press the Spartacist League and some of these other Trotskyist groups, they'll insist World War II is still happening. Well, Sam Marcy said that the Workers' Revolution that Trotsky had predicted did happen. It just didn't happen in the first world. It happened in the third world. And he said that Kim Il-sung and Mao and Fidel Castro, they were the inheritors of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, and that the third world uprisings that began in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, that was Trotsky's prediction coming true. And that became his position. And that's why he embraced Mao. And he thought Mao was more revolutionary than the Soviet Union. So they thought that Mao, Fidel Castro, and Kim Il-sung, they were incarnating the Trotskyite theory of permanent revolution. They also really liked Black nationalism. And they spent a lot of time in the early 1960s promoting Black nationalists who disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr. and thought Martin Luther King Jr. was a sellout. And they would republish articles by Black nationalists who disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr. When the 1963 March on Washington happened, the march where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Sam Marcy and his followers, again, they were a very small group at that time. They went to the march with a with leaflets of the message that Mao Zedong had given supporting the civil rights movement, and they passed out 20,000 copies of Mao's message supporting the civil rights movement with the headline "1/4 of humanity is on your side," and that was their way of trying to connect Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement with China, right? And they formed an activist group called Youth Against War and Fascism. It was kind of a street fighting activist group. And they started out by protesting against the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell, when he tried to visit New York City. And they just became this street fighting activist group, Youth Against War and Fascism, that was, run by, Sam Marcy was the leader of this group of, teenagers and 20-year-olds called Youth Against War and Fascism. Sam Marcy moved to New York City, and there were a lot of younger people whose parents had been in the Communist Party or, had grown up kind of in a household where they were taught that communism was kind of a good thing, that were against McCarthyism. And in the early 60s, they started to recruit a lot of these like teenagers who had a positive view of communism and were interested in joining kind of a communist kids club, which is basically what Youth Against War and Fascism was. I guess the Workers' World Party had an office in Manhattan, and it was like every day they had classes, and young teenagers and college-age young people would go there, and Sam Marcy and Vince Copeland and others would give them classes on Marx and Lenin, and they would train them to go out and organize protests, against racism and against the Vietnam War, et cetera. And it was just this kind of activist youth club in New York City that was run by Sam Marcy. They actually organized the very first protest against the Vietnam War, and it was at the White House. And it, again, very small group of people, but this is like 1962, I believe, right? And it's just, there they are, bring the GIs home now, Youth Against War and Fascism. In New York City, they started, as the Vietnam War started going, in the early 60s, as the Vietnam War started going, and as, McCarthyism was starting to fade, they used to have peace parades in New York City. And this was sponsored mainly by Riverside Church, which is a very big church in Harlem. It was a church that supported the civil rights movement. It was a church that was opposed to McCarthyism. And Riverside Church would sponsor what they called the peace parades, where people would march. It was usually they'd have candlelight, if it was at night, they have candlelit vigils, or they would march and they would call for, de-escalating the nuclear arms race, et cetera. And they were very liberal. And the Communist Party USA was very heavily involved, but they would be secret. They wouldn't publicly say that's who they were. These rallies, and they weren't really anti-war rallies. They were just kind of religious rallies for peace, and they'd have ministers there. They'd pray for peace. The mayor of New York City would speak. Local Democrat officials would speak, and it was just kind of, war is bad, and Republicans are dangerous warmongers, and they're dangerous. And there's these big peace parades, and thousands of people would go to them. And the Communist Party would be there secretively and would try to boost it because that was better for the Soviet Union. Well, Sam Marcy and Youth Against War and Fascism, they organized something called the Coalition for an Anti-Imperialist Movement. And basically what they would do is they would go to the peace parades and disrupt them. And they would disrupt the peace parades, and they would heckle the Democrats that were speaking. They would call out the government for oppressing the civil rights movement. They would basically disrupt the peace parades, and they were called the Coalition for an Anti-Imperialist Movement. Because they were saying, instead of just having this pacifist liberal thing, we should have a real anti-imperialist movement. And during this time, they started raising the slogan, "Stop the war against Black America." And the idea was to connect the protests against the Vietnam War with the liberation of Black people and the Black liberation movement. Like, there's a war against Black America here at home, just like there's a war against the Vietnamese. They viewed Black people as an oppressed nation within U.S. borders, just like the Vietnamese were an oppressed nation in Southeast Asia. And the idea was, to fight for the national liberation of oppressed nationalities. They became big supporters and admirers of the Black Panthers. They used to sell the Black Panthers newspaper alongside Workers' World when they would sell their newspaper to make a point that they supported the Black Panthers. And they were based in New York City. They had people in Chicago, they had people in Buffalo, they had people in Seattle, they had people in other cities, but it was mainly a New York City centered group. All right. Now, as the anti-Vietnam War movement got really big, 1967, 1968, the anti-war movement got really, really big. There were three factions of the anti-war movement. And this is important. The first faction was called Negotiate Now. And it was led by Democrats, by liberal churches, and by civil rights groups, and the Communist Party USA. The Communist Party USA was heavily involved, but they would not publicly, you wouldn't see them. They would kind of conceal themselves. And they would not call for an end to the war. They would call for negotiations. And then after Richard Nixon got elected, in 1969, they had national moratorium marches. So they weren't for ending the war. They just wanted to freeze it. They were, moratorium. But those were huge rallies. The National Moratorium March, the moratorium march against the Vietnam War was almost a general strike. I mean, the whole, all kinds of businesses shut down. Hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets. And that was probably the biggest current of anti-war protests, was the liberal wing. They wouldn't really denounce the war. They said negotiate now. They said moratorium now, moratorium on the war, etc. That was the biggest current, but they weren't completely against the war. And that was led by the Communist Party USA, which concealed itself, and etc. That was the liberals. And the Democratic Party was involved in it. And then the second current was called the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam. And they were different. And they called for an immediate end to the war. They would say, bring the troops home now. And they organized peaceful, legal, single-issue protests. And the main force behind them was the Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyists. They also had A.J. Musty, who was an old labor organizer and a pacifist. Quakers were involved with it, the American Society of Friends. And their thing was they were for ending the Vietnam War, which the first group was not. The first group said negotiate, moratorium, but no, they said for end the war, bring the troops home. And they'd have these big mass protests in Washington, D.C., with hundreds of thousands of people would come out. However, they would not allow anything, any signs that were unrelated to ending the war. And if you came with a sign supporting the Black Panthers, they had a team of marshals that would take the sign away from you and forcibly remove it from you because they said that's unrelated. And they wouldn't allow any civil disobedience. The marchers would never clash with the police because they had a team of marshals. These guys from the Socialist Workers' Party would make sure that if the police said only stay on the sidewalk, the SWP, they would force you onto the sidewalk so the police never had to move you. They were their marches were always peaceful, single issue, and legal. No illegal activity, no civil disobedience. No signs about any issue unrelated to, it was all just end the Vietnam War, and obviously no violence or no, illegal activity of any kind. Peaceful, legal, single issue protests. And they were mass protests against the Vietnam War. And then the third current during these years was the anti-imperialist wing of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And they would go to the big anti-war protests, Negotiate Now or the National Mobilization to End the Vietnam War, and they would bring the flag of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. They would chant, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is gonna win. Or they would chant, one side's right, one side's wrong, victory to the Viet Cong. They would bring signs supporting the Black Panthers. They would bring big pictures of Mao, big pictures of Stalin. And they would get into fistfights with the Socialist Workers' Party, with the people organizing the marches, and they would get into fistfights. What's interesting is Workers' World and Youth Against War and Fascism, they were technically Trotskyists, but everyone identified Trotskyism with the Socialist Workers' Party, and so a lot of times when these crowds of anti-imperialists would be fighting with the marshals, they would chant against Trotsky. They would chant, every chicken needs a pot, every ice pick needs a trot. They would also chant, Joe Stalin, he's no fool, he killed Trotsky, that was cool. And they would fight the SWP marshals as they waved their Vietnamese flags as they, as they chanted in support of the Viet Cong, as they had signs supporting the Black Panthers. And it was largely Maoist groups, Students for a Democratic Society, and Youth Against War and Fascism, which was the Workers' World Party youth group, the Marcyite group led by Sam Marcy. And during these years, they were really into, I guess you could call it adventurism, property destruction, breaking windows, getting into fistfights with police officers. You hear stories of like there'd be a big anti-war protest coming up, and at the Yoff office, they would almost have like they rev up like a football game, and they would get pumped up, and they would wear football helmets, they'd wear them to the protest because they expected the police would club them on the head. And they'd go out in their football helmets, and every single one of these teenagers would get arrested. Every single one of them. They would all end up in jail, and it used to be that if you got arrested, they would let you out of jail pretty quickly. Nowadays, if you get arrested, at a demonstration, it's often you're going to be held for 26 hours, for 3 days or whatever. But in these days, things were a lot lax, and so they would let them out, within a few hours. And so, Sam Marcy would sit all night in a Chinese restaurant down in Chinatown by the jail, and these teenage kids and high school kids would come out of jail one by one. And it was like Sam Marcy was this guru. He was in his 40s. He's a lawyer, kind of a wealthier lawyer, and he had a collection of teenage kids who were his street fighting club. Basically. And they would go out and break windows and wave the Vietnamese flag and get into fistfights with police and chant victory to the Vietnamese and support the Black Panthers and get beaten up and go to jail. And he would bail them out of jail. And it was just kind of this street fighting club in New York City, basically. Youth Against War and Fascism, Workers' World Party. So, now, at the time, the Soviet Union and China were the two biggest, socialist countries in the world, and they didn't get along with each other. And the Workers' World Party originally had supported China because they thought Khrushchev was, selling out the revolution, etc. But China started aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union. In 1968, there was an uprising in Czechoslovakia against the Soviet government. And the Soviet Union sent troops to Czechoslovakia, and China opposed the Soviet Union in doing so and denounced the Soviet Union for sending troops. Well, Sam Marcy supported the Soviet Union. In Angola, there was a communist resistance group among the African people to the Portuguese that was led by, it was called the MPLA, the Movement for the Liberation of the People of Angola. Well, China started working with the CIA, and they had a group that fought against the MPLA in Angola, where it was aligned with the CIA. It was like a rival group that wasn't even really communist. It was called UNITA, and UNITA was basically a CIA group, and the Chinese were sending weapons and support along with the U.S. government to fight the MPLA in Angola. And 1973, Richard Nixon went to China, and China welcomed him, and China began calling the Soviet Union Soviet social imperialism. And China aligned with the United States against the Soviet Union. Well, Sam Marcy denounced China for doing that, and he supported China, and he supported all socialist countries, and he didn't take sides in the Sino-Soviet split. He supported all the socialist countries, and that was a unique position to take because the Communist Party denounced China and thought Mao was a crazy, brutal dictator. The Maoist groups, they denounced the Soviet Union and called the Soviet Union, said the Soviet Union restored capitalist. It was imperialism, restored capitalism. It was an imperialist country or whatever. Well, the Workers' World Party supported both the Soviet Union and China and Albania and Cuba and North Korea and all the socialist countries. And they basically started criticizing China for aligning with the United States. The Soviet Union never particularly gave much support to the Workers' World Party because of their Trotskyite roots, etc. The Soviet Union primarily only supported the Communist Party USA. However, the Workers' World Party became very close to North Korea, so much so that there was a Workers' World Party member named Andy Stapp. and he was a soldier, a soldier during the Vietnam War who denounced the war and tried to organize a union among soldiers. And he actually moved to North Korea and lived in North Korea for several years. And every day he would give broadcasts over the DMZ, calling for the soldiers on the border with North Korea to come to North Korea and join the revolution. And Andy Stapp, a member of the Workers' World Party, lived in North Korea for 2 years. In addition to that, Sam Marcy met with Kim Il-sung on a number of occasions. And they also had a particularly close relationship with Gaddafi's government in Libya. After the 1969 revolution, Gaddafi came to power in Libya, and they admired Gaddafi. And that, like, the Soviet Union was the main country opposing U.S. imperialism, and the Soviet Union was pretty moderate. However, there were a number of countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union, like Cuba, like North Korea, like Libya, that were in the Soviet camp, but they were more radical. And that's who the Workers' World Party supported. That was basically their ideological allies, right? The Communist Party represented the Soviet Union, was very moderate. The Maoist groups represented China and China's position. And the Workers' World Party, they represented Cuba and North Korea and Gaddafi's Libya and like the more radical wing of the Soviet camp. After the death of Che Guevara, Cuba started an organization called the Tricontinental Congress. That various rebel groups throughout South and Central America, Libya and North Korea, and eventually in Ethiopia, you had the government they called the Derg, led by Mengistu, and that's who the Workers' World Party supported. They sent members to Deirdre Griswold went to Ethiopia. She was a big supporter of the Derg. And that they tended to support like the third world radicals that were aligned with the Soviet Union. And that really, they emerged as a political party during the upsurge of the 1960s. The anti-war movement was very big. The Black Freedom movement was very, very big. And they were a small little communist sect that, because they embraced the civil rights or the Black liberation movement, and because they embraced the anti-Vietnam War movement, they recruited a lot of teenagers that were really attracted to the street fighting and breaking windows and the radicalism, and were supported the Vietnamese, etc. Were attracted to anti-imperialist politics. That's who they were recruiting. And they by 1970, 71, 72, they were about 1,000 people. They went from being a small little group of 30 or 40 people. They were about 1,000 people in the early 70s, which is pretty significant. Now they were never as big as the Communist Party, which had, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 members. They were never as big as the various Maoist groups. The Revolutionary Communist Party had about 5,000 members. The Socialist Workers' Party was roughly that size. They were always smaller than the bigger communist groups, but they were pretty significant. And especially in New York City, they were very visible. They were well known. They were kind of a fixture of New York City politics. They had members in Detroit. They had members in Buffalo. They had members in Cleveland. And they were just one of the communist parties that was very large during the 1960s. Now in 1972, by 1972, it became clear the movement was over, right? The anti-Vietnam War movement just was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the Black Liberation Movement had been crushed by the FBI. The Black Panthers were on the retreat. And so at that point, the Workers' World Party decided to change their tactics. And they formed something called the Center for United Labor Action. And the idea was that this would be like a community group, an activist group that supported labor unions and was trying to nudge labor unions to be more communist oriented. This is a photo of a protest by the Center for United Labor Action. It says, "High food prices eat up our wages while we eat less," right? And they're protesting inflation and the rising food prices. And they organized for veterans benefits. They had a march on Washington demanding that Vietnam veterans be given a veterans pension and be provided with jobs. And they tried to organize around economic issues. And the idea was that, working class people kind of like during the Great Depression, right? The Communist Party had recruited a lot of people by organizing these big protests, demanding jobs and demanding, food for unemployed workers, et cetera. And so the idea was that they would, these working class people in America that were anti-communist, they would want to protest the food prices that were too high, and they would not like that, and so they would join a group led by the Workers' World Party, and then they would gradually get recruited. It didn't work. It did not work. And that they worked really hard to conceal their communist politics, and it just didn't work. I mean, the white working class at this time, they had a very high standard of living, during these years, the U.S. economy was very, very strong, and the black community was radical because they were angry about racism, etc. But the white working class didn't want to hear it. And the white working class was very anti-communist and very conservative, and Face to the Masses was a complete flop. They did not really recruit anybody, and it really just kind of resulted in the party kind of getting smaller. They did recruit people from other communist groups, and as the 1970s went on, China's politics shifted after the death of Mao, the rise of Deng Xiaoping. China's politics really shifted, and the Maoist communist groups that had been aligned with China, they all started falling apart. They didn't know what to do. So a lot of them would join the Workers' World Party because they were a communist group that was, that was active and was still together while the Maoist groups were collapsing. And there were a lot of people that were in various pro-China groups who merged into the Workers' World Party. What's also interesting is that the Workers' World Party was a little less crazy. A lot of the communist groups during these times, I mean, in Workers' World Party too, they were all heavily infiltrated by the FBI. And it was really common for communist groups to beat each other up, to show up at others' events with baseball bats and weapons and beat them up. It was really common in communist groups that you'd be required, you would, have to sign over your entire paycheck to the group, and then they would just give you an allowance out of it, and they would keep your whole paycheck. You'd have a fake name and stuff. And then a lot of these communist groups in the 70s were completely nuts. They were completely nuts. Workers' World Party was not nuts. People used their real names. They didn't get into fistfights with other groups. And in fact, they had a rule you weren't even allowed to talk about other parties. That wasn't even allowed. You just had to pretend the other parties didn't exist. And so they were not crazy. And so people from other communist groups would join them because they seemed less crazy. They weren't beating up other communists. They weren't using fake names. They weren't demanding you sign over your entire paycheck. And, they were a little bit less crazy. They just seemed like normal people who believed in communism. And so they recruited a lot of people from other groups, but they didn't recruit from among the masses. The idea was that all kinds of average working class people would join their protests to, for lower food prices or against unemployment. That didn't happen because the economy of the USA was still very high, and the working class was very conservative. So then 1974, there was a moment in 1974 that's very, very important. And this really set the stage for Marcyism, deteriorating into what it is today. I mean, this was a very important moment. So 1974, in Boston, the city of Boston, they started integrating the schools, right? There was a white side of Boston and a black side of Boston. But they started busing children to random schools in order to make sure there were no black schools and white schools, to have school integration. And the white Bostonians, the working class white Bostonians, most of whom were Irish, some of whom were from Eastern Europe or were Italian, they were racist, and they did not want their kids to go to school with black people. And so you had very ugly race riots in Boston, where these white workers, this is a very famous photo of a white worker with an American flag, spearing, getting ready to stab a black worker with his American flag. And you had these right-wing racist riots in the city of Boston against school integration. And it was the biggest right-wing pushback against the 1960s. People talk about white backlash. It was, you'd had the civil rights movement. You'd had the Black Liberation Movement and all of that, and this was the first major right wing mobilization against it. Was the racist riots in Boston where they were attacking black school kids. There were some school buses that were bombed. There were a lot of fist fights, and it was very ugly. There was an ugly racist moment in Boston where these white, Irish American, Italian American, largely Roman Catholic, urban Bostonians, many of whom were Democrats, many of whom were in labor unions, many of whom had kind of a left-wing economic perspective. They were racist, and they did not want black people coming to school in their neighborhood. They did not want their kids going to school in the black neighborhood, and they were racist. And it was a big shift in American politics. So how did the communist groups relate to this? Right. So we obviously had these racist riots against Bostonians, against school integration. However, the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam were also against busing, and they didn't believe in school integration either. They believed in black schools for black children. And the communist groups largely supported black nationalists. They supported black nationalism because they viewed black people as an oppressed nation. So it got kind of tricky, right? The civil rights movement, the NAACP, they were for school integration, but the Black Panthers weren't, and the Nation of Islam wasn't. And so it was complicated. So what happened? Well, the Communist Party USA and the Socialist Workers Party, they supported busing. They said racism is bad, integrating the schools is good. The Maoist communist groups, they didn't quite know what to do. The October League, which was a big Maoist group, they started promoting the writings from the Nation of Islam and from the Black Panthers that were opposing busing. They didn't come out against busing themselves, but they kind of boosted black nationalists who opposed busing. And the Revolutionary Union, which is now called the Revolutionary Communist Party, they changed their name in 1975. They became the Revolutionary Communist Party. They actually supported the racist riots. They said that it was a working class uprising against busing. And they said that, the answer is communism. It's not busing. So they actually supported the racist riots, which was, shocking, right? But they said basically this is a working class uprising and busing isn't the answer. So they supported the racist riots. Well, Workers' World Party, they took the position of, they didn't exactly support busing because they had to support the black nationalists who didn't, but they saw the racist riots as the main threat. So they organized a march in Boston called We Say No to Racism. And this march was different than anything the Workers' World Party had ever done because it was the first time they organized the rally themselves. Usually the rallies, they went to the big rallies and disrupted them and tried to bring communist politics into them. This time they organized the rally. And secondly, they completely concealed their communist politics. They were told to never talk about communism. Their message was, we say no to racism. And at this rally, various Democrats spoke and were given the platform, and they did not talk about communism at all. And they never, the idea was communism would scare people away from it. This is just an anti-racism march. And they got about 20,000 people to come to this very big rally called We Say No to Racism, and in which various Democrats got up and said racism is bad. And you would have had no idea that any communists were involved. They completely concealed themselves as an organization, and it was just a liberal rally saying racism is bad. And that kind of became the model for how the Workers' World Party started organizing in the late 70s and in the early 80s. And this is where the beginning of things starting to shift, right? So for years, and I was in the Workers' World Party in the 2000s, and at every convention, there would be a speech where they talked about the racist riots in Boston and the We Say No to Racism march. It was like their proudest moment, the best thing that they'd ever done. And they always talked about the RCP and the October League and how these communist groups had made this mistake of supporting the right wing. And you can never support the right wing. And there's never any support for the right wing. And wasn't it amazing that we organized this great rally in Boston called We Say No to Racism? And that became like cemented in the minds of Workers' World Party. We organized this big liberal rally. We defeated the right-wing anti-busing movement. So a guy named Brian Becker joined the Workers' World Party during the early 1970s. Now, he was not old enough. He's not technically a boomer. He's a little bit younger than a boomer. And he joined the Workers' World Party as the turn to the masses was going on, and as the We Say No to Racism stuff was happening in Boston. And, he's from a millionaire family in upstate New York. He was part of like a liberal church. I think it was Episcopal or Unitarian, one of these liberal churches. And they had a youth group where they were getting interested in communism. And so Brian Becker and his brother, Richard Becker, and his brother's girlfriend, who is now his wife, Gloria LaRiva, they started going down to New York City and going to Workers' World Party events. And they joined the Workers' World Party. And this little clique, Richard Becker, Brian Becker, and Gloria LaRiva, it was, 3 people. And they were wealthy. They were from very wealthy, families. Brian Becker didn't have to have a job. His father just paid for him to have a really fancy apartment in Manhattan. And he was from a very wealthy family, and they just, and they were just part of the Workers' World Party, these rich kids from upstate New York. Now, Brian Becker learned the art of staging liberal rallies, right? And that's when he came into the party, the We Say No to Racism march, etc. And he learned the art of staging liberal rallies. And the biggest thing that the Workers' World Party ever did, this is the biggest thing they've ever done, they've never done anything that was anywhere near this big since then, was in May of 1981, after Ronald Reagan was elected president. Ronald Reagan was elected president, and it was considered kind of a repudiation of the 1960s. He said, let's make America great again. And, Ronald Reagan was a conservative, was in favor of military spending. And so all of a sudden there was a feeling among a lot of the liberals that we need to revive the anti-war movement. And so Workers' World Party called a national march on Washington called the People's Anti-War Mobilization. And they got over 100,000 people to come to the rally. And it was, the People's Anti-War Mobilization, the People's March Against Reaganism. And what's interesting is that, if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post article about it, it says only 20,000 people, but a number of people who were there said it was almost 100,000 people. And it was the first national anti-war protest with a gay or lesbian speaker, because Workers' World Party was pro-LGBT. It was the first national anti-war protest with a Palestinian speaker. And even though this was a peace march, they made a point of supporting, not the Contras of Nicaragua, I'm sorry, that's a typo, of supporting the Sandinistas of Nicaragua, supporting North Korea, and supporting Cuba. And there was like a Cuban government person who spoke at the rally. There was a Sandinista supporter who supported at the rally. There was a speaker who called for peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula and supported North Korea. And it was, it was kind of like, the SWP, the Socialist Workers Party, they had run the big peaceful, legal, single issue protest during the Vietnam War era. But the Socialist Workers Party was collapsing at the time. They had sued the FBI, and the lawsuit, they sued the FBI, and then the FBI started feeding disinformation into the SWP, and the SWP started collapsing. So they started running the big anti-war protests. And while the SWP, their big anti-war rallies in Washington, D.C., they were peaceful, legal, and single issue. Workers' World Party's rallies, they were peaceful, legal, and multi-issue. And that these rallies that they did, they would include every issue you ever heard of: gay rights, Palestine, the Philippines, North Korea, Cuba, black political prisoners. It was not just about one issue. It was about all kinds of stuff. So this rally that they did in 1981, which is the biggest rally they ever did, Brian Becker was heavily involved in it. The Workers' World Party did it along with a Maoist group called the Communist Workers' Party. Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, the Weathermen, right? They'd been Weathermen terrorists, and they had surrendered and turned themselves in, and they got like no sentence, no punishment, because the FBI had violated the law in going after them. And they sponsored this rally, and it was very large. And at the time, the Unification Church, the followers of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, they were very anti-communist. They mobilized something called Causa International, which was an anti-communist activist group. And so hundreds of Unification Church members came, and there was a fist fight between the Workers' World Party and the Unification Church, because the Unification Church was against Cuba. They were against the government of Nicaragua. And so there was actually a big fist fight at the march between the Unification Church and the Workers' World Party marshals. There was like a scuffle that happened. This was like the biggest event the Workers' World Party ever did. Now, around the early 80s, Workers' World Party, this was kind of the height of their influence. There were a lot of people who'd been in various Maoist communist groups who joined them. And they started having a big anti-war rally, a big peace march in Washington, D.C. every year. Once a year, they'd call a big march against Reagan and against the Pentagon, etc. And it would have a different name every year. It was the People's Anti-War Mobilization. It was the All People's Congress. It was the Movement for a People's Assembly. They would come up with a new name every year, but it would be the same thing. And it would be a rally organized by Workers' World Party. They would control the stage, and all the little tiny communist groups would come and sell their newspaper. And you could only get to speak at the rally if you got their approval, and they would reserve the permit and set up the stage. And they were the stage managers of these anti-war protests that happened every year. And because they were organizing these big protests, they were a very significant communist group. They were targeted by different communist groups that didn't agree with them. The Spartacist League was a communist group that they denounced Workers' World Party for having peace rallies, because they said that only a violent revolution can bring communism. And so they showed up at some of these anti-war rallies with baseball bats and weapons and got into fist fights with Workers' World Party members. And it seemed like they were probably being infiltrated by the government or something like that, because why would you attack a peace rally because it wasn't calling for violent communist revolution? That was weird. Black nationalists also did not like the Workers' World Party because they supported Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela, who was the leader of the African National Congress, he wanted South Africa for everyone who lives in South Africa. He wanted to end apartheid, but he didn't want to deport the white people. There was another group in South Africa that was led by communists. It was called the Pan-African Congress, and they wanted to forcibly deport all the white people. And a lot of black nationalist groups supported the Pan-African Congress and hated Nelson Mandela. And so there was a lot of instances of various black nationalist groups getting into fistfights with the Workers' World Party. I believe Workers' World Party had an event in Detroit called the All People's Congress, where they had an event, and a number of black nationalists showed up with firearms and waved firearms around and threatened them at the event. And that a lot of black nationalists really hated Nelson Mandela because he wanted to allow white people to be part of the government of South Africa. So that was a big disagreement. So between the Spartacist League and the black nationalists. Now, over the course of the 1980s, these rallies became more and more liberal and less anti-imperialist. In 1989, after Ronald Reagan had left office and then George H.W. Bush was elected, the rally they called that year was actually called "We Won't Take 4 More Years." I mean, that just sounds like a Democratic Party rally. I mean, that could be a rally to elect the Democrats. But that's how liberal their rallies were getting. And at the time, there was a big movement against nuclear power. And the nuclear power protest movement was being paid for by the oil companies, because oil companies didn't believe in nuclear power because it would put them out of business. And we also know the anti-nuclear movement was used by the CIA. And, in the United States and in the Soviet Union, they'd have a big day of action to oppose nuclear power and nuclear weapons, right? You had the nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union, and you had 3 Mile Island in the United States. And there was this big movement against nuclear power, and it was a way that the Soviet Union could be penetrated by U.S. intelligence. Leftist activists would go to the Soviet Union. Bernie Sanders was going over to the Soviet Union very frequently. They had a sister city, and that, the idea was, and what was going on was that the new left, the liberal hippies that were opposed to nuclear power, they were covertly boosting the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, right? In the Soviet Communist Party, there was one wing they called the hardliners, and they were converting to Russian Orthodox Christianity, and they admired Stalin, and they were anti-imperialist, but they were starting to become conservative and not Marxist. And then you had another wing that was led by Gorbachev, and they were basically becoming hippies, Western liberals. They wanted to make the Soviet Union just a welfare state like Norway or Sweden. They were into drugs and hippie counterculture and stuff. And the U.S. intelligence community was using the anti-nuclear movement to boost the Gorbachev wing of the Communist Party in the hopes of bringing down the Soviet Union. And, the rock bands, various rock bands started boosting, going to the USSR and playing concerts, even though the Soviet Communist Party had thought rock and roll was bourgeois decadence and it was anti-communist. Well, the Gorbachev wing, they loved rock and roll, and they loved having rock bands go over and play. And so Western new left hippie counterculture was going into the USSR. They had these joint days of action against nuclear power, and against nuclear weapons. And the new left was being used to, set the stage for bringing down the Soviet Union. The new left was a threat, whereas the Workers' World Party, they loved the new left. And their whole strategy was that if we call the rally and we set up the stage, we can push the new left, the hippies, to be more radical. That's what we can do, right? We can make the hippies more anti-imperialist. And so they joined the anti-nuclear movement, and they built peace rallies, and they organized against Reagan, and they organized against trendy liberal causes. And that was their idea, is that they would be the leaders of the movement. And that was the way to be a revolutionary, was to take over the movement. And even though Workers' World Party generally opposed the Democrats, in 1984, they endorsed Jesse Jackson when he ran for president as a Democrat in 1984. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, they were totally surprised by it. They didn't see it coming. And why did they not see it coming? Because they had not seen anything wrong with the new left. They thought that the hippie counterculture was great. They thought the anti-nuclear movement was great, and they had pandered to the Democrats. And the Soviet Union wasn't brought down by Ronald Reagan. The Soviet Union was brought down by the CIA. It was brought down by the sections of American intelligence that had turned Gorbachev and had turned the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party into assets. Right. And the Workers' World Party had pandered endlessly to liberals, and they had not seen that the new left was an ideological threat to the Soviet Union. And when Gorbachev and these various liberal leaders dissolved and liquidated, and when all these young members of the various communist party and communist governments in Eastern Europe turned out to be CIA operatives and brought down the Marxist-Leninist governments, the Workers' World Party didn't see it coming. And up until 1994 and 1995, they actually insisted that it wasn't over yet. They thought the Soviet Union was going to come back. It was very sad. And after the fall of the USSR, Sam Marcy wrote a book that's called Soviet Socialism, Utopian or Scientific, where he declared that the Soviet Union had been doomed from the beginning because there was no communist revolution in the West, right? That he agreed with Trotsky in his theory of permanent revolution, that the only place that really matters is the Western imperialist countries. And until they have a communist revolution, North Korea, Cuba, China, all these countries are just doomed. It's hopeless unless you have a revolution in the West. That's the Trotskyite theory of permanent revolution. And as the Soviet Union was falling, Sam Marcy basically just went back to that. Yeah, there's no hope. And, the IRA surrendered with the Good Friday Agreement. South Africa, apartheid was overturned and they didn't have a communist revolution. And Sam Marcy just said, well, that's because they're waiting for the workers in America to stop moving. The workers all over the world are waiting for the workers in America to move. And I sat through so many, when I was in the Workers' World Party, I sat through so many workshops or that's what they said. The workers all over the world are waiting for the workers of America to start moving, right? That there couldn't be socialism that was successful anywhere in the world until we had socialism in America, because, that's the only place that it really counts, right? That's Trotskyism, and that's not true. And if you look at the Belt and Road, and if you look at China and their rising economy, and you look at the BRICS, the workers of the world, the global anti-imperialist movement, the global South, whatever you want to call it, they're not waiting on the workers in America to move. They're just building a new economy. And that's what's happening. And the West is either going to go down and collapse like the Roman Empire, or it's going to readjust and become part of this new economy. So Sam Marcy's analysis in the 90s was just way off. He did not understand that Russia and China and Iran and all these countries were going to keep rising. He thought it's all hopeless unless you have a revolution in the West. Now, during the 1990s, right, all the countries that Workers' World was aligned with, a lot of them were falling, right? Ethiopia, they'd been very close to. It had a counter-revolution. The Soviet Union that they admired was gone. The various Eastern European governments was gone. So in the 1990s, they started getting weird. For example, they started accusing members of racism. They made it against the rules to watch the show Seinfeld. Because they said the show Seinfeld was racist. There was an episode of Seinfeld where Kramer burned a Puerto Rican flag or something, so you couldn't watch Seinfeld because it was racist. They had protests against, I think it was, NBC or CBS, the network that showed Seinfeld. They had protests against Seinfeld because it was a racist show. They supported O.J. Simpson, and they argued that he was framed by the police. And a number of their female members left because they considered O.J. Simpson to be a murderer. He'd killed this woman. He killed his wife because he thought she was cheating on him. And, they thought the way Workers' World pandered to the Black community's support of O.J. Simpson was unhealthy. They supported Tawana Brawley, who was a woman in New York who accused some prominent politicians of raping her, and her story kind of fell apart. But they kept supporting her, and they kept insisting that, she was telling the truth even after she recanted her story. And they also, Workers' World in the 80s, it became a very LGBT focused organization. Leslie Feinberg, who was the first openly transgender activist, she was a Workers' World Party member, and they became a really well-known gay rights group, right? And they were known as a gay organization. Kind of the typical Workers' World Party member, at least when I was in the group, was a boomer who was Jewish and gay, right? And it would be, like a lot of gay people, were, disowned by their relatives. Their family members would not, would disown them for being gay. But a lot of Jewish folks in New York City, they grew up in a household believing that communism wasn't so bad. They had an uncle or a cousin who was in the Communist Party. They thought McCarthyism was anti-Semitic, that, when McCarthy was saying to go after the communists, he really meant the Jews. So you had a lot of Jewish folks in New York City who were gay, and who were, from a family that, had been somewhat sympathetic to the Communist Party, or at least opposed to McCarthyism. And eventually, as a teenager or a young adult, they would meet the gay rights movement. They would meet the Workers' World Party, and it became their new family, their new home. Sam Marcy would say, "We're your family now," right? And Sam Marcy, he was this older guy who had a collection of boomers, who he became their new dad. And it was a group of kind of people that were, felt they didn't fit in with their family, didn't fit in with society. Well, they could join this radical activist group that supported North Korea, supported China, supported the Soviet Union, and engaged in all kinds of protests. And that's what Workers' World Party really was. And a lot of the people who didn't like it would call it a cult. Now, I think the cult narrative is not, it's a liberal kind of brainworm. So I don't really buy into the cult narrative, but they would look at it and they'd say, okay, this is a group of no bylaws, no constitution. It's centered around a great leader, this old guy named Sam Marcy. You follow him, and, people called it a cult. I wouldn't call it a cult. It was a counter gang. Right. It was an anti-imperialist counter gang. They were aligned with North Korea. They were aligned with the Soviet Union. They were aligned with Cuba. And they were a group that could get stuff done and organize lots of protests and rallies to build anti-imperialism. And they, it was a collection of people who were attracted to that kind of politics, and they were very much in isolation from the masses of people. And they could carry out effective operations. And they did really, really important work, defending political prisoners, supporting the Black Panthers, building anti-war protests, standing with anti-imperialist countries. So, it is what it is. Now, Ramsey Clark, who was the U.S. Attorney General during Lyndon Johnson's administration, and he became an anti-war activist. In the 90s, he formed the International Action Center, which was like an NGO that was organized by Workers' World Party members. Then they would organize protests for the Palestinians. They supported Cuba, etc. And they had an office in New York City, and they organized anti-war protests very effectively. And Brian Becker was very slick, and he learned the art of, writing the press release, reserving the permit, and all of that. And they were just kind of a fixture of New York City politics. They would protest around liberal issues and around international issues, etc. Now, Sam Marcy died in 1998. And after his death, 7 members of the party that were Sam Marcy's kind of inner circle, they became the Secretariat, which was like the leadership of the party. Now, after the 9/11 attacks, the Workers' World Party, they had always organized anti-war protests, so they started something called the Answer Coalition. Act Now, Stop War, End Racism. And the group raised a lot of money to put on anti-war protests against the invasion of Iraq. And they were very good at it. And they actually, were way ahead of the game. And so the Communist Party USA and the Democratic Socialists of America, they played catch up, and they formed something called the United for Peace and Justice organization, trying to keep up with the Answer Coalition. And the Answer Coalition would reserve the permits, and they were always trying to keep up. And it was kind of a fight between United for Peace and Justice and the Answer Coalition. And United for Peace and Justice, their rallies would be very, very single issue and liberal, and all the Democrats would speak at them. And the Answer rallies, their rallies would have every issue you ever heard of: the Philippines, Mumia Abu-Jamal, legalize marijuana, support North Korea, transgender, whatever, every cause in the world. And it would be led by them, and you had to be in with them. Brian got to decide who got to speak on the stage. That's how powerful he was, king of the protest cage. Whereas United for Peace and Justice, their rallies were very, very liberal. And in some cases, United for Peace and Justice, they would say things like sanctions, not war, and stuff like that, right? And so there was a rivalry between United for Peace and Justice and the Answer Coalition. The Revolutionary Communist Party, they formed a group called Not in Our Name. And Not in Our Name was technically part of United for Peace and Justice, but it was the RCP's thing, and they had their own rallies, etc. But those were the 3 major anti-war groups, all run by communists. Well, anyway, Brian Becker was the leader of the Answer Coalition, and he was just a good organizer. He was better at it. And Workers' World's newspaper was very boring and dull, and Workers' World's leaders were not very good at raising money and stuff. And so Brian Becker just decided to take the leaders of the Answer Coalition and form his own party, which was called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And they never really gave a reason for the split. One day, they just decided to form a new party. And they kind of launched a whispering campaign. Every person that you would ask about why PSL left Workers' World would give you a different reason, because they never publicly stated a reason. But it basically came down to, they'd say, Workers' World is a stodgy old party, and we're a new and exciting party, and we can recruit youth. We can recruit young people. And I mean, that's, to some degree, it was true, right? Workers' World's newspaper is black and white and dull, whereas PSL, when they first started, they had this glossy magazine. And they were just, Brian Becker is a slick businessman. He's an entrepreneur, and he's very good at raising money, very good at making money for himself. And he just said, why am I going to be held back by this stodgy old dysfunctional party? I'm just going to start my own. There was never any internal fight that led to PSL being formed. It was just one day they changed the locks on a bunch of the Workers' World offices and they formed PSL. And Workers' World would always say that was unprincipled. You know, if they disagreed with the party, they should have a debate. They should. But to be fair, in PSL's defense, Workers' World didn't have an atmosphere where debate was tolerated. I was in the Workers' World Party, and we would have national committee meetings that were just rallies. And if you got up and said, you know, I don't agree with this, they would take you aside and say, that was very uncomradely and disrespectful. And don't you have faith in our leaders? And, you know, you weren't allowed to disagree with the leaders of the party. So there really wasn't a venue for debate to take place within the Workers' World Party. So as a result, you know, when Brian Becker formed his new party, I mean, there was no debate, there was no discussion. It was just like, okay, well, we don't agree, so we're just going to start our own party. And that's, I mean, if you don't create an atmosphere where there's debate, that's what happens. People just walk away. They don't raise their differences internally. So the leaders of Workers' World Party always felt like they were victimized. Oh, he walked away. There was no internal procedure. Well, that's their fault because they didn't create a venue for that to happen. And I was in the Workers' World Party. And if you disagreed with Monica Moorhead or Larry Holmes or Fred Goldstein, they'd call you racist. They'd call you sexist. They'd say you were trying to form a faction and disrespecting the leadership. And that's how they operate, right? And Sam Marcy, I mean, it had worked for Sam Marcy because he was a very smart, effective leader. But the leaders of that took his place, they weren't as smart and effective. And so the group was falling apart. Now, after Barack Obama was elected president, the anti-war movement pretty much shut down. Now, PSL kept having anti-war protests, but the anti-war movement largely wasn't getting support because the Democrats were the ones leading the wars. Obama was killing people with drones. Obama destroyed Libya. Obama, started the war in Syria. And Democrats who had been protesting the war in Iraq didn't want to protest. However, public opinion became more anti-war than ever. And in fact, when the U.S. government bombed Libya, it was like 80-90% of the people were against it. And in 2013, when Obama was talking about attacking Syria with cruise missiles, it was like 80-90% of the public was against it. So why was there not a massive anti-war movement, right? You'd think with the public being so opposed to the attack on Libya, so opposed to the attack on Syria, why were there not big protests? Well, that was because PSL reserved all the permits and controls the anti-war protests in Washington, D.C., and they will not allow libertarians or conservatives to join anti-war protests. They consider anti-war conservatives, anti-war libertarians to be racist. And they insist that if you go to one of their anti-war protests, if you're going to speak, you have to be pro-transgender. You have to be woke. You have to denounce Republicans and consider Republicans to be Nazis. And so they were against building a broad anti-war movement. So what's interesting is the anti-war movement has been getting smaller and smaller and smaller ever since Barack Obama was elected. But Brian Becker has been getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. He's been making lots of money. And he's been controlling this very, very small anti-war movement that doesn't allow anybody but woke leftists to participate. Now, after the January 6th events, Brian Becker said the Democrats didn't go far enough in outlawing dissent. And he wanted a mass imprisonment of Trump supporters. And some of his different allies even called for laws like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act to be used against Trump supporters. I mean, this is absolutely nuts. Even though the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act was used to target Eugene Debs and anti-war socialists, they didn't care, right? As far as they're concerned, Republicans are Nazis. Republicans can't come and be part of the anti-war movement. Libertarians are evil, etc. Now, when the lockdowns happened during COVID, PSL had protests calling for longer lockdowns. I kid you not. At their protests, they denounced the fact that there were shorter lockdowns, that businesses were reopening. When working class people were desperate and losing their jobs because of the lockdowns, PSL wanted longer lockdowns. And then When Russia's special military operation in Ukraine began, PSL was neutral. They didn't support Russia defending the peoples of Donbass. And a member of PSL named Mike Preisner actually tweeted out that the Ukraine flags were good. The people marching around with Ukraine flags were good because they were learning about internationalism. So Mike Preisner basically announced support for the imperialist mobilization to have war with Russia in Ukraine. I mean, absolutely reprehensible. They also made a point of supporting many times. Abby Martin, Mike Preisner have supported the, quote, peace movement in Russia, which is a CIA thing led by Alexander Navalny. It's a CIA operation, but they support the so-called peace movement in Russia, when the Communist Party of Russia are the biggest supporters of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Now, after Russia's special military operation in Ukraine began, it was very clear the danger of nuclear war, and World War III was very massive. But yet the Answer Coalition did not call an anti-war protest. There was not a single anti-war protest. They run the anti-war movement. They didn't call any anti-NATO rallies or anything. So the Libertarian Party and the People's Party did. And on February 19th, 2023, you had the Rage Against the War Machine protests that happened in Washington, D.C. And immediately, the liberal establishment went into overdrive, smearing the rally. And PSL joined with the pro-NATO liberals. They claimed that the Rage Against the War Machine rally were white supremacists, Nazi. Someone who's PSL aligned published an article, and Rage Against the War Machine is anti-war, so white, so white. And they basically, I mean, and we'll get into this later, but when PSL calls someone a Nazi or a fascist, that's a call for them to be murdered, right? Now, that doesn't sound like that on the surface. That just sounds like a political slur. But if you understand their ideology, that's a call for violence. So PSL, when they called the Rage Against the War Machine rally Nazi and white supremacist, they were basically calling for everyone there to be killed or everyone there to be locked up by the government. That's what they were calling for. And then a month later, they called their own rally against NATO because they'd been exposed by the Rage Against the War Machine rally. And you remember, like, the social media campaign against the Rage Against the War Machine rally was massive because Scott Ritter was going to participate, and because various conservatives like Tulsi Gabbard and others were participating. I mean, they went into overdrive against this rally, and the mainstream media went into overdrive, and PSL was right there with Rachel Maddow and with all the liberals smearing it as a Nazi rally, hoping to incite violence or government repression against it. PSL basically wanted every person who went to the Rage Against the War Machine rally to be imprisoned or locked up. That's their attitude. They called it a neo-Nazi white supremacist rally. They called their own rally a month later that was much smaller. It was pretty pathetic. After October 7th, PSL became the main organizer of the Palestine rallies, and they have done everything they can to make sure that these Palestine rallies are hostile to Christians, hostile to Trump supporters, etc. Rather than saying money for jobs and schools for America, not weapons for Israel, which is the obvious message, right? That's America first. Instead, the message of the Palestine rallies run by PSL is America is an evil racist country, just like Israel. And it's a toxic message. And the idea is to push Trump supporters, many of whom are anti-Israel, like Candace Owens, and others, to get them to support Israel by having the Palestine rallies preach hatred for them. And it's pretty ridiculous because, the Palestinians are Muslims and conservatives. And you think they support transgender? You think they support abortion? But yet, if you oppose abortion, PSL says you're a Nazi. If you oppose LGBT, PSL says you're a Nazi. It's a ridiculous position. And PSL has done everything they can to try and keep the Palestine rallies woke and hateful. And that is a really, really important disservice that they have done. They're really trying to push Trump supporters into being pro-Israel. They want Trump to be pro-Israel, and they want to alienate and make people who support Trump feel that the Palestinians are their enemies. Now, Sam Marcy wrote this book called The Klan and Government, Foes or Allies, and he taught that the only response to fascism is violent self-defense. Now, that's actually a defensible position because he meant black people have the right to defend themselves against the Ku Klux Klan, that workers who are on strike have the right to protect their picket lines from the black shirts that would try and break their picket lines, etc. That's a defensible position. If you by fascism you mean violent Nazi thugs that want to kill you, that's a totally legitimate position. However, PSL has taken Sam Marcy's position and distorted it by saying that every conservative is a fascist, right? And if you go and listen, you can watch video of PSL PSL rallies supporting abortion, PSL rallies supporting gay marriage, PSL rallies supporting vaccine mandates. They think everyone who voted for Trump, everyone who's a Christian who opposes abortion, everyone who opposes LGBT, they think all of them are fascists. And really what they're saying, if you read The Klan and Government, they want violence against them. In fact, they even consider other communists that they don't agree with to be Nazis and fascists. And so you have to think about this. 77 million Americans voted for Trump in 2024. Does PSL want to kill all of them? Now, that sounds like a crazy thing. You'd say, of course they don't want that. Well, if everyone who voted for Trump is a fascist, if everyone who voted for Trump is a Nazi, according to PSL's ideology, they have to be killed. This is how nuts PSL is, and this is how toxic they are. Now, another aspect of PSL is that they promote degrowth. Marx said that the point of socialism is to get over the irrationality of the capitalist market and have a centrally planned economy where growth is no longer limited, and that the higher stage of communism is based on vast material abundance, right? That communism, if you read the Critique of the Goethe Program, is only possible when the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, when there's enough for everyone, when there's no division between mental and physical labor. That's the higher stage of communism. And socialist governments around the world, what do? They build, they raise people out of poverty. They have 5-year economic plans. They build power plants, they wipe out illiteracy, they pave roads, etc. PSL, on the other hand, they believe in degrowth. And their 2024 election platform called for dismantling the U.S. power grid. It was actually in their platform to immediately replace all fossil fuels with windmills and solar panels. Now, that would reduce electrical output in America to about a fifth of what it is. I mean, that's insane, right? It's absolutely insane. And that would basically mean that all the people living in rural areas, all the people in red states don't have electricity. Already the power grid in America is collapsing. It collapsed in Texas. They're frequently having blackouts in California. PSL wants to just completely dismantle the U.S. power grid. And they also oppose nuclear power, which is something that Sam Marcy would never do. Sam Marcy joined the anti-nuclear movement, but he always insisted that they support nuclear power. They just believe in workers' control of nuclear power. Very different position. But they actively want to dismantle the power grid. They're basically calling for genocide of red state workers. And that makes sense. They think all red state workers, anyone who voted for Trump, is a Nazi and deserves to be killed. So their platform calls for taking apart the power grid. It's unbelievable at a time that American working families are rising up and saying, hey, why is it our government is spending billions on Iraq when our power plants are falling apart? PSL isn't saying that's right, money for power plants in America. They're saying dismantle the U.S. power grid. It's pretty unbelievable that they believe in degrowth and they promote climate alarmism. The idea that the Malthusian ultra rich say, oh, there's just too many people in the world. We're using too much electricity. We got to reduce the population. That's why they believe in abortion so much. PSL is obsessed with abortion, and they want to dismantle the power grid. They're not promoting socialism. This is fascism. Degrowth economics is fascism. The Nazis rebooted the German economy by creating a slave labor underclass and by degrowing. And PSL, that wants to promote abortion and is obsessed with abortion because they want to drive down the population because they believe in climate alarmism. PSL, that wants to dismantle the power grid. They're essentially a degrowth party, and they're promoting fascist economics. Fascism isn't being racist. Fascism isn't when someone is mean to somebody else. Fascism is economic. Read R. Palm Dutt and his very, very good book called Fascism and Social Revolution. Fascism is an economic system. It is an economic move used by capitalism to reboot itself during an economic crisis with degrowth, by creating a slave labor underclass, by destroying the means of production. That's what fascism is. And PSL believes in fascist economics, and that's basically what they want to do. And they want to deindustrialize and de-electrify all the red states. They want to force down the population. They basically take the position that anyone that is a Christian or is culturally conservative is a Nazi or a fascist who deserves to be killed. These are their policies. This is fascist economics. It has nothing to do with what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. The Chinese Communist Party is paving roads in the most rural areas. The Chinese Communist Party is building power plants, not just all over China, but all over Africa. Socialist countries build and increase the population and increase electrification and raise people out of poverty. That is not what PSL is doing. PSL wants to decrease the population. It wants to impoverish the red states. It wants to exterminate the red state people. It wants to drive down living standards in the name of climate alarmism. They are not socialists. They are woke fascists. And Sam Marcy, I will defend Sam Marcy. He wasn't perfect. Sam Marcy had his flaws, but he was way better than PSL. Why? Well, here's a great example. In 1991, Sam Marcy, he wrote a letter to the workers of Louisiana, urging them not to vote for David Duke. All right. Many workers in Louisiana, I think about 60% of them voted for David Duke for governor because they were angry at the establishment. And David Duke is a racist, a white supremacist who presented as anti-establishment. And so a lot of white workers in Louisiana voted for David Duke. Well, Sam Marcy wrote a beautiful letter in 1991 urging the white workers of Louisiana who might want to vote for David Duke not to, and appealing to them on a class basis. And I would encourage anyone to go read that letter. It's a beautifully written letter where Sam Marcy says, look, I know you're mad at the establishment, and I know that you feel like no one cares about you and all that, but racism isn't the answer. It's a beautiful letter. Any member of PSL who wrote or said anything like what's in that letter would be expelled from PSL. The idea of speaking with or being friendly to anyone who would ever consider voting for David Duke or, God forbid, Donald Trump is considered to be an evil person. PSL doesn't want to appeal to white workers and get them to join with black workers to oppose racism. PSL just wants to murder anyone who's a conservative. They just want to recruit liberals. They hate conservatives. They hate white workers on a cultural and ethnic basis. Brian Becker is a very rich man from upstate New York, and he has a white savior complex. He believes that he was sent to earth to save the poor, oppressed black people, right? He's a rich white guy who is the savior of the poor, oppressed black people. And that's why his group tokenizes people of color. At every PSL march, they find a 20-year-old or 22-year-old black person, and they put them up at the front. And that is there to say, see, Brian Becker is the savior of the black people. And they don't respect black people. They don't believe that black people can be their own liberators. And in fact, they've worked very hard to try and undermine black nationalist organizations like the African People's Socialist Party, right? When Chairman O'Malley and the African People's Socialist Party, when they were on trial for their lives, PSL actually tried to cancel their big rally in Washington, D.C., the Black is Back March. He tried to get their permit pulled because Brian Becker thinks he's the savior of black people, not black people themselves, right? They don't like black nationalism. I mean, it's really disgusting. Well, that wasn't Sam Marcy's approach. Sam Marcy supported black nationalism. And Sam Marcy also wanted to appeal to white workers to be allies of the black working class and to move away from racism on a class basis. That's not allowed in PSL. Now, Sam Marcy also opposed Malthusianism and talked about how overpopulation was not real, overpopulation was not consistent with Marxist economics, and PSL members believe in Malthusianism. They believe that the problem with capitalism is that it creates too much growth, and they want to drive down the population. Sam Marcy didn't believe that. Sam Marcy understood Marxist economics. He'd read theories of surplus value. He understood that you cannot be a degrowth Malthusian like Brian Becker and PSL are and be a Marxist. Sam Marcy insisted that Workers' World Party never oppose nuclear power and instead just call for public ownership. However, PSL opposes nuclear power. And Sam Marcy insisted that Workers' World Party members never speak against white workers and argued that the Weathermen, the Weather Underground terrorists, their position that white workers were the enemy, that was wrong. And Marcy opposed white guilt. And he said white workers should be led to oppose racism on the basis of their own economic interest. They should see that fighting for black liberation is a part of their own liberation. PSL, on the other hand, says the white working class are the enemy, and any attempts to organize white working class people in their own economic interest or to align them with the black community in their own interest, that's an unforgivable sin, and that's pandering to reaction, etc. So why does this even matter? Why have I gone on for 2 hours about some tiny socialist group? Why does it matter? Well, first of all, it matters because the PSL runs the Palestine protests. And if it wasn't for PSL, a lot more Trump supporters would oppose Israel, right? PSL has done a lot to push Trump supporters into supporting Israel by making their Palestine protests as anti-working class, as woke and hateful and toxic as possible, by making them a hateful, anti-American woke shit show. PSL is basically blocking any support for Palestine among, Trump supporters and conservatives. On top of that, PSL members, their rallies, it's not enough that their message is bad. The PSL mobilizes, I kid you not, they mobilize their members to go block working class people from getting to work in the name of supporting Palestine. They send people out into the streets with Palestine flags to literally block working class people who are trying to get to work. There's a video of a black worker, who's trying to go see his daughter, getting out of his car and yelling at a PSL member and saying, I've got to go see my daughter. What are you doing? And this PSL member, who probably went to Harvard or Yale or Columbia, is waving a Palestine flag and trying to block a working class person from getting to work. That's what PSL is doing, right? They are very toxic. At one point, PSL was mobilizing its members to go to Starbucks and go to the drive-through window and say, I'd like to order an end to genocide, please, right? And basically harass Starbucks workers in the name of supporting Palestine, right? PSL is doing everything it can to basically antagonize and alienate working class people and push them away from supporting Palestine and get it into working class people's minds that Palestine supporters are their enemies, that Palestine hates America, that Palestinians think America is an evil country, etc. And that's why they have mobilized against the Center for Political Innovation, because we have the opposite approach. I'll just show you quickly, if I can find the video here. This was our approach to supporting Palestine, the completely opposite approach. And if you read our book on the Houthis, we are mobilizing a populist, working class, anti-imperialist support for the Palestinians. PSL, on the other hand, is trying to organize a woke anti-working class approach to the Palestine movement. And they tell their members that we're neo-Nazis and that we're fascists, which is basically a call for us to be murdered, right? It's pretty vile. But there's a reason, because we're trying to orient the opposite direction for Palestine supporters. This was our approach to the Palestine question.
American hospitals. Our government is letting this country fall apart while they spend more and more money on bombing and destroying the Palestinians. They are more concerned about enabling Israel to kill Palestinians than they are in about making sure that Americans have hospitals to go to when they're sick or have paved roads. We are here saying money for American schools, money for American jobs, not for Israel, not for Israeli crimes, not weapons for Israel. Food and health care in this country, not war and destruction in another country. That's what we're here to say. The global imperialist system is oppressing people across the planet, and it's also oppressing people right here. We are against the imperialist system. We are for a new America where working families have what they need, and growth and innovation is promoted beyond the rule of profiteers. We are opposed to the system that spreads war and spreads destruction across the planet to enrich a small group of billionaire monopolies. And that includes backing up Israel and its crimes against innovation. It's going to be good. America, not for Israeli crimes.
That's the correct way to talk about Palestine. But PSL has done everything they can to suppress that message, including launching vicious smear campaigns against me, basically labeling me a Nazi, working with people to try and destroy my reputation, inciting violence against me. Because if people talk this way, there would be a real anti-war movement in America that they wouldn't be the bosses of. PSL, basically, the last thing that they would ever want is a real anti-imperialist movement in America, because they wouldn't be the bosses of it, right? They want to keep the anti-war movement small and isolated so Brian Becker can keep making money. And it's reprehensible, and all they would have to do, right? If they don't really want to harm us, like they clearly do, all they'd have to do is say, you know what? We don't agree with the Center for Political Innovation, but they're not Nazis. We don't agree with the Center for Political Innovation, but they're not white supremacists. But they don't do that. They go out of their way to accuse us of being neo-Nazis because they want Antifa to murder CPI members. That's what they hope to do. They're basically putting a hit out on CPI because they want us to be murdered, because we are a threat to their monopoly in a business that they've set up, a business of running the anti-war movement and keeping it small and isolated. So this is worth calling out. Yes, this is worth calling out. On top of that, PSL works to insert woke and USAID funded entities into socialist countries. It pushes the idea that the people that are good friends of China, the people that are good friends of North Korea and Iran and Cuba, are the ones who believe in whatever the latest trendy woke causes are, right? And they're trying to insert pro-LGBT, pro-USAID, climate alarmism, the woke agenda into anti-imperialist countries. And it's very similar to what was done to the Soviet Union, how the new left tried to insert toxic politics into the USSR and boost the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party. That's what PSL is trying to do with China, with Iran, with North Korea, and Cuba. They want to insert and they want to boost the Gorbachev reformist woke wing of the politics of these countries to set the stage for a counter-revolution. And by pretending, or at least, maintaining, this kind of, this supposedly supporting these countries while supporting the very politics of the most vile pro-war, pro-imperialist wing of the American establishment, that's what they're trying to do. Basically, they want to do to China and North Korea and Cuba and Iran what was done to the Soviet Union. They want to boost a section of the ruling political faction that is, basically aligned with USAID and aligned with the CIA to stage a counter-revolution. And that's also very dangerous, but that's why they have so much money and funding. There's a billionaire who funds them. His name is Roy Singham, and they have a huge office in Midtown Manhattan. It's called the People's Forum. And they are very well funded because they're carrying out what is essentially an intelligence operation to get USAID and U.S. intelligence into anti-imperialist countries and to boost woke entities in those countries that will eventually set the stage for overthrowing them. And that is why they hate Trump so much, because Donald Trump is shutting down USAID, and Donald Trump is putting this intelligence wing, the Democratic Party wokest, intelligence wing, out of business. right? And so that's why they're mobilizing against Donald Trump, even though Trump says he wants to end weapons to Ukraine, even though Trump is very friendly to a country they claim to support called North Korea. They are doing everything they can to oppose Donald Trump because their gig is over. If Donald Trump is successful, their intelligence operation, the same kind of thing that was done to the USSR in the 80s, it's going to be called off, and they'll be out of business. Now, PSL basically also exists to channel young people who become interested in socialism and communism and anti-imperialism into just being Democrats, right? People join PSL. If you believe in abortion, are you going to join the PSL? Of course not. You're going to join the NARAL. You're going to join Planned Parenthood. If you believe in gay marriage, are you going to join PSL? No, you're going to join the, Human Rights Campaign or the Democratic Party or some liberal group. People join PSL because they admire Stalin or they admire North Korea or etc. So you join PSL because you have an anti-imperialist feeling. And then PSL channels you into becoming a liberal activist. There are members of people who joined PSL, and they said, it's weird. I joined because I supported Stalin, but for 2-3 years, I did nothing but protest for abortion and for Kyle Rittenhouse, right? And that basically it takes anti-imperialist people and makes them into Democratic Party allies. PSL is basically just a Democratic Party liberal protest squad. And it serves the ultra rich, and they're trying to defeat the uprising of Donald Trump. And they have a soft power strategy for manipulating socialist countries from within and boosting the reformist and, counter-revolutionary wing of socialist countries. That's basically what PSL is. And we should be very clear about that. So that's why they matter, is that there's a lot of people who really want to do what the Center for Political Innovation does. They really want to march with, jobs and schools for America, not weapons for Israel. They really want to study the Green Book by Muammar Gaddafi. And they really want to study the Juche ideology of North Korea. And they join PSL thinking it's a real communist party. And they end up, protesting for abortion and protesting for transgender and protesting against Donald Trump. It's a very, very effective mechanism for preventing genuine anti-imperialist politics from emerging. The Center for Political Innovation was formed to oppose the PSL movementism. And we no longer call ourselves communists, but innovationists, because we want to make clear that we want growth and we celebrate human creativity. And it's important to note that PSL and groups like it, they break people's spirit, and they have a bitter cancel culture atmosphere. The amount of verbal abuse that goes on in PSL, the amount of tearing people down and all of that. And it hurts people psychologically. It wears you down. Most people quit PSL after 1 or 2 years because they can't take it anymore, right? And they also realize PSL has no plan to ever become a mass political party, to ever grow. PSL is simply an operation. It's an intelligence operation to stage liberal protests, etc. So when we formed the Center for Political Innovation, our slogan was out of the movement to the masses, and we need a government of action to fight for working families. And we have a very different approach. We don't hate the working class. We view the working class as our friends and allies. We want to build a working class movement against imperialism. On top of that, we wave the American flag. We love our country, and we say this imperialist system is bad for American workers. And we put forward a program to rescue our country from imperialism by building a new America. Now, that's what we're about. So we have a very, very different approach. And I think a lot of the people who join PSL are really looking for what we're about. And I hope that some of them will see this stream and consider joining the Center for Political Innovation. And that's why it's important to talk about. So yeah, that was my slideshow for tonight. I hope that folks enjoyed it. And I hope that I justified why we exist, right? Because ultimately, I would hope that CPI, as we grow and flourish, we won't have to talk about these other organizations. We'll be big enough that people just kind of come around and join us. But right now, we're a small group, and we have to explain why we exist. People say to us, why don't you just join the Communist Party? Well, because that would mean we'd had to campaign for Kamala Harris. Why don't you just join the PSL? Well, I just spent 2 hours explaining to you why if we joined PSL, we'd be on the wrong side and we'd be working against anti-imperialism, right? Why don't you just join one of these other groups? Well, no, we have to have the Center for Political Innovation because no one is doing what we are doing. We stood with the Uhuru movement when none of these communist groups would do it. We organized the Peace MAGA brigades to boost support for North Korea inside the MAGA movement. We are urgently needed as a movement. The Center for Political Innovation is a very, very important movement, and we must exist. And that's why we exist, and that's why we will continue to exist. And that's why we don't just join one of these other groups. So I hope that was informative.